Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dan Pontefract, who is a best-selling author and leadership strategist. He was the former Chief Learning Officer at TELUS, a Canadian telecommunications company with revenues over $14 billion, over 50,000 global employees, where he launched many award-winning initiatives that dramatically increased the company's employee engagement. Prior to that, he held senior roles at SAP, Business Objects, and BCIT. He's also a best-selling author, and today we're going to focus on his third book, which is Open to Think, Slow Down, Think Creatively, and Make Better Decisions. He suggests that in order to mitigate the calamities such as the relentless pursuit of action, mixed with the pressure to do more with less, individuals and teams must combine creativity, critical thinking, and applied thinking to their approach. Welcome to the program, Dan.
Thank you, Charles. So great to be here. Can't wait to dig into this meaty topic.
It's definitely meaty, but before we start unpacking some of these big ideas, love for our listeners to learn more about your background.
Yeah, I'll try to be as quick and succinct as possible. So my last name, Pontefract, is Latin for broken bridge. So I kind of cheekily suggest I'm trying to be the opposite of my last name, Charles. I'm trying to build bridges with leaders to leaders and organizations to organizations. So I'm kind of what I call a pracademic. So I started out in academia, and then I went and sort of applied that from a practical sense in the corporate world. So between basically three big gigs, between, as you mentioned, BCIT, SAP, and TELUS, I found my way in between the leadership, business, technology, how do you build great culture space, and went out on my own as a company of one 5 years ago. And yeah, I've written 5 books now. It means I'm a masochist. And I do a bunch of consulting and speaking and workshopping, and can't wait for this particular one as well, of course.
Wonderful. Well, let's dive into the book. And if you could just kind of, for our listeners, briefly explain the main idea behind your book, Open to Think. What inspired you to write it?
My inspiration comes from the fact that I'm always studying us, the human beings. And in particular, I spend so much time with leaders that I am studying them probably more so. And this book, although it published in 2018, was being written in 2016, 2017. And at that time, I'm still in the corporate space, meaning I'm an executive at TELUS as its chief envisioner. And I'm working with lots of different people in that role because it's an external consultancy that I had developed. So we're working with all kinds of organizations that are TELUS clients on their culture, on their leadership. And in and amongst working with all these different types of leaders, I sort of recognized that there was something brewing. And Charles, that was just basically busyness. And the busyness was aided and abetted by distractedness, which was aided and abetted by some paralysis by analysis, the sort of flip side. And what I was noticing, I should say, was, well, why do we think that we can just keep piling on more doing without really stepping back and saying, well, how do we do the doing? What goes in, what goes out, and how will we become more effective, even more efficient in that modeling? Because we just kept adding more and more. And so there I went off, sort of investigating and researching and interviewing a whole whack of people. If my theory was right, I think it was. But I must say, Charles, I think it's worse than ever. So my book has not made a dent.
Well, like we were saying, though, before we started the interview, is that it seems to me that you had a crystal ball, because this is more relevant and more needed now than ever. And I just want to get that word out, because I think when they read it, it will make a dent for them to be clearer thinkers, less busy, and more mindful of where they're really hopefully going to focus their energies. And your approach has 3 different pieces: creative thinking, critical thinking, and applied thinking. And you have certain questions that an individual should ask for each one of those as we unpack each one of these. But give us that framework. Why pick these 3 for the open thinking framework?
So yeah, the book's called Open to Think, first of all, and I'm being cheeky with that because it's a double entendre. And so I want people to open the book to think better, but they also encourage them to be open, literally, to think. And I think that's part of the double entendre point there is that we become very closed in our thinking. And what I mean by that is we spend a lot of time in that third component, which I call the applied thinking, which is the doing component. And so if you're only doing, you're closing yourself off to arguably the two more important pieces or components to open thinking, which is, as you mentioned, creative and critical thinking. And I got to say, Charles, that I'm actually doing a disservice to the model because I'm honestly reiterating something that Mrs. Guyot told me in grade 5. And Mrs. Guyot in Hamilton, Ontario, just outside of Toronto, where I grew up, instilled in me in my grade 5 class the importance of creative and critical thinking. This was a woman whom said, we are here to be creators. And so we'd spend a lot of time as kids sort of thinking about creativity and creative thinking ultimately. But she also weirdly, I'm only a 10-year-old, but I still remember it vividly, kind of using some of those judicious decision making skills and like how to do computational reflection, right? On is it this apple, this pear, or this banana? And it's like, so it just Mrs. Guide is really the reason this book came to be because I reflected back on that year in elementary school and it was, oh, so maybe that's what we're not doing. The stuff that Mrs. Guide told us to do 30 odd years ago is not happening and we've been fixated on the doing. So hat tip to Mrs. Guyot, Charles, and us maybe, hopefully, spending a little more time in those two echelons, the creative and critical thinking.
Well, let's talk about creative thinking because you're right. We're always rushed. We have so much to do, so busy. We don't take time to reflect, to wander, to really be alone with our thoughts, to come up with these creative ideas. I love a story that you tell in the book about the origin of lifesavers. And what are some ideas? Maybe you could unpack that story for us, give us more insights in that if you recall that. And then just give us some insights into what we can do to allow for that time each day to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that particular story is one in which there's an adage that I use in the book called marinate in the moment. And if you're so quick to not just make a decision, but so quick, obviously, to take action, then you'll never know if you'll get a hole in the lifesaver. You'll never know if you're possibly create these molds and what they might turn out to be when you're actually just marinating, literally, in a world of possibility. And so, as you mentioned, the point of reflection, do you reflect in creative thinking? Is exactly that. Do you dream? Do you marinate in that moment? Are you allowing yourself the time to generate and unleash new ideas, like ideas from the past where you're looking at saying, well, maybe this could work? And it's completely that. It's this whole era of reflection that when we're so busy and pedantically peripatetic, moving around a lot, I should say, maybe in a simpler language, then we actually can't unleash those new ideas. We don't marinate in the moment, and the lifesavers will never come to be as a possibility for goodness in my mouth.
Oh, great story. And you're right, that marinate in the moment. I love that concept. You also bring some famous individuals into the stories as well. Warren Buffett, he takes time every single day, spends a lot of time reading, thinking, not really investing too much time in meetings. Bill Gates, his famous Think Weeks are designed for that as well. So, if these individuals that are famous, that are successful, doing it that way, hopefully that'll give us some insight that it is important and it's something we should make time for during our day. What happens though if the organization doesn't buy into it? What are some of the ways in which we can try to get better buy-in with our organization so they see the need and the importance of it as well?
So glad you brought up Buffett because ultimately there is a good metaphor for what I'm on about, and that is: do you time manage? I don't think that Warren Buffett manages his money; he invests. So maybe we need to sort of take a look at our calendars and the way in which that we operate each and every day. And as opposed to saying, "Oh, I'm so busy, my calendar's out of whack," in you're a time mismanager, as opposed to thinking of it as managing time. We only, each of us, you and I, Charles, have 168 hours a week. So maybe what we need to be teaching ourselves and our leaders teaching our team members is, how do you invest the time? So if you're investing, that's, putting money in, so to say, as to how you want to spend your money. So let's look at creative thinking. So if you're thinking, pun intended, I suppose, but if you're thinking as a leader, well, how much time are we investing in our own creativity, that marinating in the moment? So, what tactics are we using? Just start at the team level. What tactics are we using to say, you know what? Yeah, I realize as a leader that we're spending way too much, investing too much time in the doing and not enough time in the creative thinking. So maybe we need some tactics there in order to unleash some of that creative thinking. So, how? Well, have you ever thought about like a think week? Could you have brainstorming days once a month? Could you have brainstorming afternoons? Could you have 2-hour dedicated slots where people are just able to not do, but riff? And it seems so contrary because we leaders have been ingrained and we've been tattooed into a culture where if I don't look busy and we're not doing, then we're failing and we're not more effective or efficient. The productivity, the performance lags. But in essence, what I'm saying is that just like Bill or Warren, in the ways in which that they're investing their time for Think Week or for 1 hour meeting a day for Warren, you're actually saying, well, no, the time that I want to invest with, the more I can do with myself or my team to maybe nurture those ideas, nurture those brain synapses from hitting and colliding with one another. Don't you think maybe some better ideas might be garnered from there? Might there be some ways in which that we're thinking, oh, I never thought of it that way. That might be more effective and efficient. So rather than just the doing, as I'm mentioning, taking a step back, investing in that creative thinking slots, just to start there, is probably a pretty good call to make.
And there's lots of techniques that you can do, because I hear this a lot from leaders that they're just not that creative. They just, they aren't a creative person. I think that's a skill that can be built. And some people confuse that with they're either creative or they're not, as some innate ability. I would disagree. But if you don't take time to daydream, if you don't take time out of your day to ponder these questions and to really think how non-connected things might be connected in some way by reading different things, watching different things, then that's never going to happen. That skill's never going to be fully developed.
Precisely. And so we can enter into the quagmire known as social media in this case, and there's pros and cons to socials. And what I mean by this is, if you're filling every moment up at a bus stop or in the tube or wherever the case may be, right? Elevators, and sort of not bumping into someone and saying, "Hey, how are you?" And if you're just constantly just investing your time to spend on what's going on out there in the world or catching up in emails, like there's a lot of doing. But there's some pros to social as well. If you dedicate time to say, well, you know what, I'm going to spend an hour on YouTube looking at ways in which to do X differently at our organization. So there's nothing wrong with social media. There's nothing wrong with spending time on a laptop, on your phone, on an iPad, whatever. But there is something wrong if you're using it in ways in which that just burn time. And that's something that I think leaders really need to help their team members see, because there's a lot of burn time out there, in my opinion, Charles.
So some great tips that we covered for creativity: stop over programming every minute, listen, pay attention, and observe. I've read this a lot, heard this a lot from great creatives. It's not about them inventing something, it's about them observing something and then they connect the dots and write it down. A lot of us have great thoughts, but if you're not capturing them in some way, shape, or form, I know, Dan, you like Evernote, but whatever form you do, just make sure that you capture it down. Don't rely on your memory to remember when you need that information, because likely at that point it's going to be gone.
Yeah, the eureka moments, basically, right? When they come into your head, and if you're busy and are not capturing them, like you can just tuck those away, whether it's Evernote or some notepad, or even when you're transcribing something to yourself, you're just taking a verbal audio note, right? gosh, they're so good when you can have a bank of them left in some sort of online system that you've created for yourself to go back and kind of review and like, oh yeah, I remember that from that meeting or that walk or what have you. So, gosh, that's such a good one. Thanks for reminding me of that itself, Charles.
What I love too to remind people of the functional fixedness of our thoughts and our frames that we normally have. And I love the example you give in the book about World War One, how the French thought World War II was going to be fought one way, but in fact it was completely different by the Germans, and it made their life easier, made their victory even quicker, because the French were still thinking in that old frame, and that functional fixedness approach didn't serve them well.
What a great story that, well, it's not great, but if you're a historian, you sort of look for examples where you're like, well, what could we learn from this? It's a great story. So it's called the Maginot Line. And the French were so excited. They thought World War II, which had not been deemed a world war at that point, but everyone figured Hitler was going to start invading territories in Western Europe. So the French were like, you know what? We got to build better trenches because it's going to be trench warfare 2.0. So the Maginot Line, which is this imaginary line, well, not really, but it's between the French and the German border. And the French decided to build this most elaborate, concrete proof tunnel system that had, you could get your haircut down there. There was a cinema, like it just went on for kilometers and kilometers and kilometers. But the Germans, well, the Nazis, I won't say the Germans, the Nazis decided to invent an entirely new way of war called blitzkrieg. And blitzkrieg, in two different ways, basically means you stun your opponent in sort of pincer movements using kind of art of war language. And they kind of took art of war and they took their own thinking and their own technology advancement. They're like, we're going to scare the heck out of these people by being quick and flanking so that they have no way out. And they did that repeatedly in the Netherlands and Belgium and certainly at the Maginot Line. And the French had no way out. They're like, okay, here's our country. So again, terrible in terms of human history, but there's a very stark difference between going back to what you're used to and maybe in this case the Nazis were like, actually, maybe we could do this differently. What are your ideas, team? And they came up with something called blitzkrieg.
So we talked about the creative piece. Now let's talk about the critical thinking piece, which I think is more important than ever. And you mentioned that it's the most difficult possibly out of the three to develop. And I think it's exacerbated now by the fact that we're inhibited by technology. We're outsourcing everything, including our critical thinking, to technology. And talk to us a little bit about how technology has made it even less so that we're exercising this critical thinking muscle.
Well, I mean, Charles, this is one man's opinion, but is slightly backed up by research, and we've become lazy. So, lazy in the sense of how do we quickly get to a decision because the pressure of me having to do a lot more on top of what I already do is there, it's palpable. And so, whether these days, don't forget this book was released in 2018, but written in 16 and 17, these days, what I see is a whole heck of a lot of, let's let old Chatty sort this out for us. So, Chat GPT or other GPT models are now becoming the almost a de facto decision making framework for many people. Like, tell me what to do here. What do you think? Like, how can I make this quicker, better, faster? So I'm excited about some of the creativity that old Chatty, as I call it, can unleash. What I'm frightful of is that people will outsource the decisions that need to be more thoroughly thought through from good investment of creative thinking metrics and ideas to then say, oh, no, the AI told me this. So terrible. To your point about Frost, so I opened the book with a poem. It's a Frost poem. And basically, I'm about 7 or 8 paragraphs in, I think. And I'm kind of cheekily taking people down a path that suggests that the poem is called something else. And still to this day, in the however many people have read the book, no one's ever come back to me and said, like, screw you. Like, why'd you do that to me? But it's kind of the point is that it's a setup. Like people gloss over the poem and the title that I put in right in the beginning of the book before they even get to chapter 1. And that's kind of what we're doing. We're living in our decision making by what I call fridge magnet theory. And because we're only looking at small snippets of things, like in the case of the Robert Frost poem, the last 3 lines, as opposed to the 20 lines, what happens is we're not, again, taking that time to say, well, what's the judicious assessment and analysis of all things that I need from an input perspective before making a decision? That decision needs to be rational and timely, but not at the expense of not knowing all the facts and the data. Same thing with your point about the Pope. So when thousands upon thousands of people were duped by a very fake press release in 2015 that suggested the Pope Francis had endorsed candidate Trump at that point. You've got that thing went viral everywhere, not for the right reasons, for the wrong reasons, because people on a certain set of the spectrum of the political arena said, "Oh, isn't this great? Look, this candidate's got the approval of a pope." Now, first of all, no pope ever would seemingly support any political candidate, let alone one in America. But people didn't stop and think critically. Thumbs up or thumbs down? Does this make sense to you? Which again goes back to when we outsource our thinking to the mass and the mass is wrong, we end up looking quite foolish and we're going to make some seriously bad decisions, as a human being back to our organizations to put it back in a frame of reference.
Well, those two are great examples, just strengthening your point about critical thinking, that we don't look at these ideas under a critical eye and really examine the veracity of those, right? We just assume that whatever on social media, whatever we heard with the buzzwords is there. Now, fake news and alternate forms of propaganda, they've always been with us. However, access to modern technologies, I would say, has accelerated and amplified this impact greatly.
The wildfire propagation opportunity of social media and even email, quite frankly, but nonetheless, like technological means, I mean, far outweighs like the leaflets and pamphlets that were being dropped in World War II by the Nazis over certain cities in Western Europe and England. So there's an example, right? But for us to step back, or not to step back, I should say, even whatever, it's not about politics, it's not that, it's just about us in our humanity. To not step back and to critically analyze and assess before expediting a decision. Back to marinate in the moment, it's equally important in the creative thinking realm as it is in the critical thinking realm to be able to stop, pause, and say, what is the impact that this decision will have? What is the impact of what I'm reading right now? Is it true? Is it verified? Have I fact checked this? I mean, another great example of recent days would be certain networks in the US hiring literally fact checkers. I mean, you didn't need that in yesteryear, but these days you need it to prove a point, to say, stop believing the brush fire of insanity. You got to stop and sort of pull back and say, is it true or not? That's where we are, Charles.
Well, let's look at some of those behavioral attributes that make up critical thinking. You give 5 of them, and those are deciphering, collaborating, time, decisions, and flexibility. Love to talk a little bit more about that first one, deciphering, because we're inundated by information, by facts. And I think I forgot who said it in the book, but how he breaks up his day in terms of sifting through all this information. So, he spends 20% of his day reading as broadly as possible about trends affecting the world, another 20% of his time learning about new solutions of what they're designed to do. The ones that interest him, he spends another 40% trying to sort out what they actually do. And then the remaining 20% listening and watching people trying to learn about their needs and issues. A great way to break down your day to become a more critical thinker.
Well, I mean, that comes down to the point, what's your discipline? The whole open thinking model between the 3, creative, critical, and applied, comes down to the discipline that you need to put in to the input and output of your thinking. And so if you have the discipline in you to, for example, calendarize your day so that you do have color-coded opportunities, whether your Outlook, Google Calendar, whatever you're using, to say, this is my creative thinking time, my critical thinking time, or my applied thinking time. And what I mean by that is you're just categorizing. And you do have to start asking yourself, of again the 168 hours we each both have in a week, what are you doing to properly invest in that? And when we hope for the best, Charles, in terms of where our critical thinking goes, where do you fit it in? So you're smushing that in where? So if you've not set up a point or time or a discipline, the muscle that allows you whatever percent it is, 10%, 20%, just time in the day, time in the week, time in the month. If you're not proactively invested in some sort of methodology that is going to allow you to say, oh, you know what? I've got time set aside. I've invested in me already to actually process all of these inputs, and then maybe I need to involve people. Maybe it's not just the buck stops here, I'm the boss decision. Maybe I need to go iterate a little bit, which is the whole point of open thinking. It's iterative. So you can go back and forth between creative and critical, for example. It's like, okay, now I think I've got enough input. Now it's time to make that decision. And now I'm going to switch over to my green color and we're going to apply that decision. And so I mean, I'm oversimplifying it probably, but at the end of the day, how you're creating the discipline in you between the three types of thinking, I think is just rule number one, firstly.
Well, and then having that discipline to be focused so that you allot that time and prioritize it. You mentioned in the book, and one of my favorite authors is Cal Newport, and his book Deep Work, and what he looked at with Adam Grant and how prolific he was, and really carving out portions of the day for those most important tasks, whether you call them the MITs, whether you call it your deep work that you need uninterrupted focus time on for critical thinking, for creative thinking. That's essential, because if you just have intermittent interstitial slices of time throughout the day, it just doesn't work the same. It's not the same quality, and you aren't going to get the same results.
I have a stat, and this is from Atlassian. So Atlassian found that 73% of all work suffers from proper deep work. So again, back to Cal and sort of hat tip to Cal, he found that basically three-quarters of the things that we're doing are at the expense of having the time in which to do the deep work. So there's a suffering of the output or the performance. And so when you start looking at like BLS data or Statistics Canada data or the data in the UK and Western Europe through the EU, we all can see a performance degradation over the past several years. And it's not just pandemic related. So it was coming into the pandemic for 4 or 5 years, and now we still sit at this degradation point. And I'm thinking to myself, well, actually, folks, we knew this was happening. There's a corollary to what it is and how we spend and invest in that time. So when we're not, again, saying, you know what, folks, we're going to invest a day or 2 days in just grappling with what this problem is and brainstorming and ideating and whiteboarding and getting people in and out and getting different thoughts and opinions and ideas, like that's the problem, is that we're not invested in that time spent on, again, the interrelationship between the critical and the creative, frankly.
For those behavioral attributes, is there one more important for critical thinking to occur than the others? We kind of touched upon the deciphering, getting that information into a manageable framework so you can critically think about it. But the other ones were collaborating, time, decisions, and flexibility. Have you noticed from your experience, your work, your coaching of different corporate clients, is there one they commonly struggle with?
I keep going back to the time piece, and I know it may sound like the proverbial broken record, but when a leader doesn't build that muscle in the team to say, well, this is how we do that investment, then what happens is everyone's left to their own devices, literally at sometimes, right? And they're like, oh, so this is how it goes. And added on to that is the culture of busyness. And when that culture of busyness is about the doing and it suffers and takes away from the time investment, obviously in the critical thinking phase, it just gets kind of thrown by the wayside. And what do you have? You have ineffectual, potentially ineffective decisions that make you do rework downstream. And I think that's part of the problem of the performance lag.
Absolutely. You mentioned too, there's great advice that you give, time cushioning. So put that cushion of time on either side of different tasks so you're not hectic in your schedule each and every day. Outsourcing the minutia of your life so that you don't have to deal with everything. having realism, right? So far too often, critical thinking is treated as an all-you-can-eat buffet, which is really not. And I love the one about situational capacity. I haven't really heard that term before, but maybe perhaps you could just give more insight into that for our listeners.
Let me first start with time cushioning, and I'll come back to the second one on situational capacity. So, time cushioning is we're so used to back to back to back to back meetings. And however, when I say, okay, are you just doing the default of Google Calendar or Microsoft Outlook or what have you, and you're just booking a 60-minute meeting because? So, what are the organizational, or at least as a leader, a team norm? So, do you need 60-minute meetings, or could they be 50 or 45? And then you're sort of asking yourself, well, what about the buffer in between a days? And just anyway, you're thinking about time and the cushioning aspect so that you have buffers to get to the loo or to stop and think, well, how did that meeting go? And writing your notes. Maybe it dawned on you that there was a new idea that was germinated. Do you have time to write that down anywhere? So that's the time cushioning piece. That's ultimately what I'm getting at. But situational capacity, I mean, that's asking yourself, do you have some sort of mechanism to signify, like maybe you use like different colors, maybe it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe it's a star system, whatever the case may be. Like, how do you say this is what this is worth? And I mean, not everything is about the military, but we can learn a lot. There's a reason for DEFCON 1 through 5 because that's essentially situational capacity. This is the threat level of what things are happening, and this is what how much attention we should be paying to this. And so that's the same with reflection and action. So is there a way for you to self-analyze the sort of appropriate level of reflection and action that you need to take on whether it's a color system or a 1, 2, 3, 4 system, what have you? That's what that means. You're basically taking the time to self-assess and create almost like a prioritization schemata for you to then employ as one of those disciplines or muscles.
The other one that I saw in the book, and you can see right behind me up there, is based on this, and that's the circle of competence that Warren Buffett made famous. And in his office, he has that same picture with his face on it, obviously not Ted Williams, showing basically that you need to know where your circle of competence ends and begins and focus on the areas in which you can really differentiate yourself and your brand.
Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, that was a huge hat tip, and thank you for that. At the end of the day, we're all living off of the backs of giants who have done this before, and there's a good one where it's like attribute and hat tip to him on that one because it just makes so much sense to the open thinking model.
Well, let's move to the third and final piece of this, and that's the applied thinking piece. So that's the commitment to execute on a decision, right? And we started the conversation with saying a lot of people just are in execute only mode. They like to apply things without properly reflecting on it, making sure they have the right creative mix into that solution and critically think about it. But applied thinking could, I mean, you argue that it's arguably the most difficult to understand and improve. Why do you think that?
The reality is that we are all suffering from the relationship between our prefrontal cortex and our amygdala. In the less fancy way of saying, the prefrontal cortex is where your executive function resides. So your EF, it's often called, and that's the ability to categorize the doing in ways in which that can be done efficiently, effectively, and with rigor. Whereas amygdala based decision making to action is emotional. And it's the ways in which that often too many leaders sort of sway with the doing. And it's the culture piece. It's like, no, you've got to be calm. Like, not everything needs to be emotional and outbursts, etc. So I think we need to do a better job, first of all, on the doing when it comes to being categorically executive function or EF focused and specific. So that's kind of one. When you talk about that, or when I get into that from the amygdala perspective, the emotions that we have as leaders for the doing, it's sort of like whiplash. And we move on from one thing to the other. It's shiny object syndrome. It's bosses putting more work on other bosses who put that work on their team, which could be bosses, of course. And it's this domino sprinkler sawed off shotgun approach of amygdala emotion without stepping back and using your kind of executive function to say, well, how busy are people right now? Like, can they handle more, or should we just keep dumping on them? So this idea of too busy to be busy or not to be busy really comes down a lot to who are you as a person, as a leader? Are you more executive function related, or are you more amygdala emotional related? And I think that has a huge problem. It's a huge problem, sorry, to solve, Charles, in the way in which that we're treating people in the doing phase itself.
We have a good solution with that to get more executive functions to applied thinking. You give really 4 tips. And the first one is be mindful, right? Remember what is relevant and pivotal in completing a task. Easier said than done, because like you said, if an amygdala hijack happens and you just get enraged with something, you're not going to pause, think, and reflect, and you're just going to act. And I think we're in execute mode so often that becomes our default setting. So it's really hard to get us out of that, to be more mindful in the moment and conscious of and pause and reflect before acting.
Yeah, I mean, the first of those four, be mindful, also is almost a hat tip to do you believe in your purpose, vision, mission, values, strategic plan, or not? So the mindfulness piece there is saying, okay, so what is relevant? What's pivotal to sort of us completing, quote, the task? But how does it, are you mindful not about just the human being, but mindful to how this relates to purpose, vision, mission, values, and what we're up to? And again, back to amygdala, if you're not mindful and you're acting with emotion and dumping more on people, et cetera, then you forget what the purpose is, what the vision is, what the mission is, what the values are, what your stated strategic intent is. And people are like, what? Wait, whoa, 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 what happened? Like, I thought we were like moving to this 3-year plan. Where did this thing come from? Why did we just pivot and go this way? So I can see that a lot. You can see that a lot actually in employee engagement anecdotal comments where the team member says, yeah, just totally non-mindful about what we're trying to do here, not relevant, doesn't understand, and keeps dumping new things on us. And that's a problem, clearly.
What a tool you give too to help out with this is, once again, coming from the military, that after action review that allows teams to analyze how that previous project was, right? Did it meet its intended goal? Because you really need your working memory to function correctly and have clarity if you're going to have optimal decisions.
So one of the things we haven't brought up, which is I think I'll do now, is even though there's kind of wordy, like creative thinking, critical thinking, applied thinking, the simpler way to think about it is dream, decide, do, repeat. And the dream, decide, do, repeat mantra, when you're doing, and back to repeat, when you've done the doing, what happens is, well, arguably, you should probably go back next door and critically think about what worked and what didn't. So you're just kind of like saying, look, it's not a 1, 2, 3 model. It's an integrated, iterative, like just decide where and when you need creative, critical, or applied thinking. But yeah, when you're done the done or done the doing, you are now in an opportunity to evaluate, to assess, to do, as you say, the ARAs, the after action reviews. And these are the chances for you to critically think about, well, how did we do budget? How did we do time wise? How do people feel? Are people disengaged? Why do people lose their minds? Why is so much infighting? Why didn't that team work with us? Why did they work with us? And to take those learnings for the next time, and then you park them into the creative thinking time. You're like, hey, what did we learn the last time we did X? Oh, we're on to Y now. Oh, let's add that to the creative thinking time. We're like, yeah, look at all the learnings we got there. But Charles, what happens? We don't do after action reviews. We don't do evaluations. We don't do, I hate the term, by the way, it's terrible, but postmortems. Like the chance to sort of say, well, what happened here? Because why? Because we go on to the next thing so quickly and it's more doing. So it's so important to have that opportunity to reflect and learn how we did the action so that the next time we dream and decide, we've got that tuition value, I'll call it.
When you mentioned too that another trait that you found in all open thinkers, right, that helped them to demonstrate this creative, critical, applied thinking framework better is they're always learning. They're continuously learning something. They're learning from their experiences, like you said.
One way to, I've never done this before, and it's not in the book, but it dawned on me metaphorically because of where I'm sitting today. So travel around any neighborhood in North America, Western Europe, wherever, it doesn't matter, Australia. And you're going to see probably somewhere between 4 and 8 decades of different architecture, from houses to condos to large apartment plots and so on. Now, don't you notice that the architecture changes? And whether you believe in it's better in the past or better now, it's different. So architects, builders, designers, etc., are learning from each time that a house or a condo or whatever has been built. They're like, what can we do to either save money, make it more environmentally friendly? How do we maximize space and smaller footprints, and so on? That's the point. Every time they've built a house, they're actually thinking about, well, what did we learn from this? What can we take to the next one? Otherwise, all our houses would look the same. And I think that's me having now built a house, by the way. Like, Denise and I have learned what we were going to do differently for the next time we build a house. And so that's the point ultimately, is that this whole, as a recovering chief learning officer, Charles, this notion of continuous learning, I think, has to be almost systemic to your open thinking model.
The next piece, which I love, is the be attentive in the applied thinking framework, right? Stay flexible, yet focus on specific actions. Love the story you give about Natalia Martinez and her solo climb of Mount Logan in 2017, how she really had to be flexible, right? Because her goal changed pretty dramatically within a couple hours.
Yeah, so that short story-ish is wonderful in the sense that Natalia survived, but her goal was to do a solo mission up Mount Logan and to reach the summit. And of course, mountains are full of snow and hazardous wintry conditions. And when it gets really hazardous and wintry, sometimes you might not make it. And I mean, when not make it, not up the mountain, but in life. And so she has this wonderful anecdote essentially. So, like, I had to decide whether or not I was going to push myself to the point of possible death, or am I going to be flexible and change my goal of survival and focused on surviving? And that is just a wonderful little microcosmic look at that. Sometimes you have to be attentive to the reality of your situation as a leader and recognize, might not work out this time. So I'm not going to be rigid and just plow through up the mountain, so to say. I'm going to take my time, figure out how to get out of this. And ideally, in this case, she was rescued and saved.
The other two are being ruthless and being humane. Anything about those that you would like our listeners to know?
So the ruthless part is back to one of those disciplines I alluded to, and that's you, the muscle of you being ruthless with your calendar. Like, the impulsivity of social media, the impulsivity, the destructiveness and irrelevance of a lot of things that you shouldn't be doing when you're just doing garbage things and not fueling yourself with the right type of doing. And I'm being unable to block out and being completely fixated and ruthless on the focus that you need to the doing. So, for example, to put this into layman's terms, if you have a laptop and a monitor, let's say, and you're working from home office or cubicle, wherever your office, and every 44 nanoseconds, you have in the top right hand portion of your screen, Apple or Microsoft notifications, and then you have your social notifications, and then you've got your phone not on vibrate or silent, but it's pinging you with these bing, bing, bing. Like, that's not being ruthless. That's allowing Silicon Valley to dictate your stress level, and you're not going to be able to be ruthless in the focus there. So that was number one. On the humane side, now you're a leader. So are you basically empathizing? That's the key word here. Are you demonstrating empathy? What I call head, heart, hands. So are you intellectualizing what people are like thinking? Are you humanely feeling what they're feeling? And will you use your hands to do something about that? When you're humane, you realize that there's a lot of pressure on our people, on your people. And you're there as a leader to not just protect, but to guide and teach and facilitate what it is that they need to be doing to get in control of their doing. So ruthless, you, humane, others.
Great distinction. Thank you for providing that. I agree. Being ruthless, blocking out anything that's irrelevant, right? But be humane and be empathetic to people that you work with and those you serve. It goes such a long way. And I think it could be, all leaders could use more empathy and keep that skill stronger and stronger over time. Before we end the episode, love that analogy that you gave at the end of the book that kind of sums up this whole open to think approach, and that's the popcorn metaphor. And what does that have to do with open thinking?
Oh gosh, you really did read the book. This is fantastic, Charles. So I'm English, which is a fancy way to say we don't believe in microwave popcorn. And so when I grew up, and I continue to this day with our kids, we cook popcorn with one of those old kettles and oil, which is not good for you, obviously, and kernels. But the metaphor here is like, okay, so how do you want your thinking to be? Well, think about it this way. There's kind of four types of popcorn, effectively, right? And that is when you're going into the popcorn making process, you've got to pick the right pot. There are ones that will sort of not provide as much convection, and there are others that will. So you got pot selection. And so I'm going through the creative, critical, applied thinking metaphor here, or metaphorically. There is different types of kernels as well. So you really have to think about the colored ones, the maize souffle ones, and so on. You got to be thinking about oil. So decisions on what type of oil to what heat, and at what heat then now you're asking yourself, so is it gas? Is it electric? Is that different? So there's all these inputs, and it's just popcorn. People are like, are you crazy, Dan? I'm like, well, metaphorically, work with me. So now you've kind of decided on oil and pot and level of temperature and so on and so on. And now you're ready to start doing. But equally so, you've got to be an open thinker on the doing part, because you could do one of several things, right? You could undercook your kernels to the point where they don't even pop, and you're serving boiling hot kernels to your kids, which is going to make you go to the hospital because they've got oil holes in their throat now from the burning hot oil. You've got, well, I waited slightly too long, but not long enough, meaning, or not too long, where I burnt it. It's still edible, but it tastes, it's burnt. The third one, of course, is, well, you did it all well. You've got fluffy, delectable popcorn. It's fantastic. And then the flip side of that, of course, is you looked at your phone, the boss phone, you went on to do something else, you forgot about the pot on the stove, and you've now got a fire in your kitchen because you're completely distracted. So any of those four, if you're thinking about a 2x2 matrix, are possible, but equally important is the inputs on the creative and critical thinking to get to that potential fluffy, delectable popcorn era.
Thank you for providing that metaphor. I'll never look at popcorn making the same way again. That was I will definitely put more creative thought and critical thought into that process as a result. So, as we're ending today, just love to leave our listeners with a call to action. What would you recommend to leaders listening to apply first in this framework, or is there a first step?
Yeah, that's a tough one, but a good one. I'll say this: you have to self-reflect first. Like, you have to take a look at your calendar, your conduct. What are you espousing? What do you demonstrate? What is it that you're role modeling or not? So when, just a little example here, Charles, when if you're in a meeting and it's a conference room or even it's online, and you're not there, but you're there, like, there's a defocused leader. So how are you possibly going to help in either creative, critical, or applied thinking if you're not there? So that's like kind of one of the points. Stay focused. That's one of the suggestions in the book. Do something to help yourself demonstrate what are these components of open thinking. When you start demonstrating it and uphold that, gosh, like, you got a team now. They're like, oh, okay, well, this is what we believe in around here. So we're probably going to be better at it over time.
Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Well, I mean, for this particular piece of work, I think opentothink.com is the easiest method to get there. And that'll take you to a bunch of other places within the site to learn a bit more about me.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.